Ladies, gentlemen, friends, colleagues, welcome to the Edmund Burke Theatre here in Trinity College, Dublin, and a particular welcome to everybody who's joining us online as well, those of you who are here on a rather dreary evening. So it's fantastic just to see the auditorium packed, and I take great pleasure in welcoming you to the first of our Behind the Headlines discussions for the academic year 2019-2020. My name is Jane Ohlmeyer. I'm the director of the Trinity Longroom Hub, which is an internationally reputed research institute focusing on advancing collaborative research in the arts and humanities. I'm going to say just a couple of words about the Trinity Longroom Hub before we turn to the proceedings this evening, because basically we do three things in the Trinity Longroom Hub, and that's what the building looks like. It's literally above us. The first thing we do is promote the excellence of the arts and humanities here at Trinity, and that means disciplines, history, English, the creative arts, religion. There are just a few of the disciplines that comprise the arts and humanities, and many of our graduates this evening, in fact all of our graduates this evening, come from an arts and humanities background. All of our speakers, I beg your pardon, are graduates from an arts and humanities background. The second thing we do in the hub is we bring the humanities together with the sciences, because we believe that where the disciplines collide, the magic happens. We also believe that some of the world's great challenges can only be solved by collaboration across disciplines. So we spend a lot of time thinking about this and interrogating the great societal challenges from an inter and multidisciplinary perspective. The third thing we do is public humanities, and this is a great example of our public humanities initiatives, where we want to bring the learnings of the arts and humanities to the widest possible audiences. The fact that so many of you are here this evening, we're really delighted that you are on that journey with us, so thank you for coming. I also just want to thank the John Pollard Foundation, and especially Stephen Vernon. It's lovely that you're with us this evening, Sir Stephen, because actually your funding makes this Behind the Headlines series possible, and we're extremely grateful to you. So, to tonight's discussion, the future of Ireland and its borders. Speaking as somebody who grew up in Belfast during the Troubles, with an 84-year-old mother who lives in South Armagh and commutes to Donegal, with a son living in London, I can safely say I still wish that Brexit won't happen. However, here we are, now fast approaching the latest deadline of the 31st of October, and we're preparing for the worst case scenario, a no-deal Brexit. Of course, fears around a hard border being reinstated have resurrected old tensions. However, this time, we hope that we can also imagine new possibilities and new futures in a post-Brexit Ireland. And we hope tonight to bring nuance to that discussion with the aid of a stellar panel of speakers, and I'll introduce them in a moment. I do, however, want to say that over the course of the next academic year, the Trinity Longroom Hub will be celebrating its 10th anniversary, its 10th birthday. And the broad theme of the future of Ireland is something that we're going to be coming back to in virtually all of our signature events, because we want to reflect on the major changes that have occurred in Ireland and indeed the world over the past 10 years, and we want to imagine how the arts and humanities can shape discussions on where we're going over the coming decades. Tonight we have an absolutely stellar panel of speakers for you, and I'm going to introduce them very briefly in the order in which they'll speak. So our first speaker tonight is Rory Montgomery, who read history here at Trinity. He recently retired from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, having served most recently as Second Secretary General with responsibility for EU issues. This meant that Rory was at the epicentre of discussions around Brexit, very much at the front line. I'm really thrilled that from January, he's also going to be our practitioner, our policy practitioner in residence at the Trinity Longroom Hub, where he's going to have the opportunity to explore many of the issues he's going to be talking about this evening. Our second speaker is Etain Tannen, who's Professor of International Peace Studies in Trinity's School of Religion. She's become a very prominent commentator on Brexit, on UK-Irish relations, and on cross-border cooperation. Her book, entitled British-Irish Relations in the 21st Century, will be published next year, 2020, and I hope it's a bestseller, Etain. It certainly should be, because she has been a very active contributor to numerous reports about Brexit, to both the European Parliament and to both Houses of Parliament in Westminster. Our third speaker this evening is David Kenny, who is a Professor of Law at Trinity. His research interests include referendums and the constitutional implications of Brexit for Ireland. Together with Etain and Oran Doyle, also from the law school, David will be one of the few key members of a new working group on unification referendums on the island of Ireland, working closely with colleagues in University College London and Queen's University Belfast. That was in the news last week, and obviously we're absolutely delighted to be part of that conversation, and that David, Oran and Etain will, I think, play a very important and significant role in those conversations. Our final speaker this evening is Jan Carson. Jan read English at Queen's and then theology at St Andrews. She's a writer and community arts facilitator based in Belfast, and her most recent novel, The Fire Starters, which was published in April 2019, won the EU Prize for Literature for Ireland, and so obviously congratulations on that, Jan. She's obviously also published a novel which is called Malcolm Orange Disappears. Now, I have not read it, but I certainly want to with a title like that. Just before we turn to our first speaker, just a few housekeeping things I want to bring to your attention. The format for this series is as it always is. Each of our speakers has 9 minutes. They'll each have their 9 minutes, and then it'll be over to you for questions. And I would ask you to ask your questions briefly, keep it brief and keep it direct. I also, though, would invite you to put your phone on silent. There was a phone ringing earlier. If you put your phone on silent, but do share your thoughts, your photos, your comments on social media by tagging at the TLRH Hub and using the hashtag #HubMatters. This talk is being live streamed and then will also be made available through a podcast on our website. So now, if I could invite you, ladies and gentlemen, to join me in welcoming our first speaker, Rory Montgomery. Rory.
Well, thank you very much, Jane. It's wonderful to see such a large audience here today, including some people with whom I used to work very closely in my recently finished career in the Department of Foreign Affairs. So this is an enormous topic, obviously. Huge number of questions raise themselves. I think we probably have only scratched the surface when we come to start thinking about the future of Ireland and its borders. But I think it's precisely this kind of event, and as Jane said, there's now beginning to be a number of academic and other initiatives to look more carefully at these issues. I think it's essential, as I say, as we go forward, that the civil society and academia work together in a way which, as I say, illuminates issues which are ultimately, of course, for political and then finally a popular decision. So I thought tonight, to start off, I thought it might be helpful just to look again at what the Good Friday Agreement actually says about Irish unity. In the Good Friday Agreement, there is a constitutional issues section, 6 subparagraphs, and the agreement also included within it the texts of the change of Articles 2 and 3 of the Irish Constitution, which were subsequently adopted by referendum in May 98, plus the relevant British text of the relevant British legislation, which was contained in the Northern Ireland Act, also of 98. Now, 3 broad themes. So what does the Good Friday Agreement say? What does it not say? And what does it say or suggest about the nature of United Ireland? And all of these questions point to major issues of process and of substance. Now, I was involved in the negotiation of the Good Friday Agreement, and in fact, in particular, or not least, on the constitutional text, I think we have to remember that these texts were produced late, under ferocious pressure. The last days of the negotiations were, frankly, close to chaotic. Many of the issues which are raised by the text were not in any way the subject of meaningful discussion among the participants before the text was adopted. The main focus of the last week was on the institutions, the Northern Ireland Assembly and Executive, and North-South institutions, plus decommissioning and prisoner release. So in a way, if you try to sort of subject the text to a really close exegesis, you won't be surprised to find that there are many gaps. The other point I suppose important to make is that when we were doing all this 21 years ago, the question of how a future referendum on unity might actually be conducted and what the consequences would be and so forth, seemed were rather far in the distance 21 years ago, as I say. So certainly for a generation at least, it has not been necessary to look in detail at these questions. So what does it say, the Good Friday Agreement? Paragraph 1.2, the participants, i.e. governments and the parties, recognise that it is for the people of the island of Ireland alone, by agreement between the 2 parts respectively, and without external impediment, to exercise their right of self-determination on the basis of consent, freely and concurrently given, north and south, to bring about a united Ireland, if that is their wish, accepting that this right must be achieved and exercised with and subject to the agreement and consent of the majority of the people of Northern Ireland. Long sentence. One of my colleagues once said, the great John O'Neill, we were trying to win the Nobel Prize for Peace and not for literature. And paragraph 1.4 then says that if indeed the people of Ireland do exercise their right of self-determination to bring about a united Ireland, it will be a binding obligation on both governments to introduce and support in their respective parliaments legislation to give effect to that wish. Now, as I say, this is supplemented then in relation to respect to Northern Ireland by the Northern Ireland Act, which I mentioned earlier. That provides that if the Secretary of State, if at any time it appears likely to the Secretary of State that the majority would vote for a united Ireland, then he is obliged to hold one, to hold a referendum. And then that can only happen once every 7 years. In other words, if there's one referendum and it doesn't succeed in Northern Ireland, then there can't be another one for 7 years under the Good Friday Agreement. And then just to say, I know there have been many people who have said that a 50% plus 1 majority requirement is potentially extremely destabilising and dangerous, but that's what the text of the agreement says. It's a majority. A majority is a majority is a majority. I remember a Sinn Féin group raising this point very explicitly with me in the final stages of the negotiations, saying, why don't we say simple majority? And I said, well, look, majority is majority. And all the more so, in an contrario argument, of the fact that the arrangements for a qualified majority, as it were, in terms of Northern Ireland's Assembly, are set out elsewhere. And then finally, in terms of our own constitution, I mean, it doesn't explicitly refer to a poll in the Republic, but it does effectively confirm that one must be held, because it must be the consent of a majority of people democratically expressed. And then, as I said, it's concurrently, as the text says. So in other words, two referendums have to happen at the same time, as happened in '98 with the Good Friday Agreement and the changes to our constitution. So again, to quote David Trimble in another very different context, we have to jump together, north and south. Now, what does the agreement not say? Well, and I will just list these questions without going into the implications, which are many. On what basis does the Secretary of State, or would the Secretary of State, make the assessment that a majority is likely? Opinion polls? The result of elections in Northern Ireland? A vote in the Assembly? Having come to a determination, how much leeway would he have, or she have, in terms of timing? How quickly would a referendum have to be held? And then, this is a strange absence in the text. Obviously, if two referendums are to be held on the same day, north and south, it is, I think, unacceptable that the Northern Ireland Secretary of State alone would be the person who determined the date for referendums in both parts of the island, including in the Republic. So clearly there would have to be, effectively, a consultation with, discussion with, agreement with the Irish government. And what indeed if the Irish government feels that the timing maybe is politically not right, irrespective of what the British legislation says? Then, of course, there's the whole question of a dialogue with the Assembly and with parties and civil society and others about the process. There's a sort of a question about, which David can talk about maybe, what would be the nature of a poll in the Republic? We've never had a plebiscite in the Republic. All our referendums have been on changes to our constitution. But it seems to me that you probably would have to have a plebiscite on the basic question, and then later on a more detailed constitutional revision. But that's one of the many matters for discussion. And then, of course, big question. We've all seen with Brexit how dangerous it can be to have a referendum in which nobody actually knows what the result means. But how far could it be made clear in advance what unity would involve? What process would there be? Would there be a forum of parties like the New Ireland Forum? Would there be citizens' assembly or assemblies? How would you engage with parties and individuals both north and south? In particular, how would you engage unionists? And in particular, if unionists are going to fight tooth and nail to defeat a referendum on unity, how could they be expected to take part in this discussion about what a possible United Ireland would look like? So ideally, all of these questions would be worked out before a poll. Not so likely, perhaps. What happens then after a poll? Again, the agreement doesn't really address these points. Obviously, one very big question, what if the South says no and the North says yes? Unlikely, you may think, but it's just a hypothetical possibility. Now, the governments have a binding obligation to introduce legislation. I said that earlier, it's in the agreement. The Northern Ireland Act, however, speaks of such proposals to give effect to United Ireland as may be agreed between the governments. That's what the British government has to do in Westminster. But again, many open questions. What time frame? What process? Yes, the two governments would have to be involved, but obviously it couldn't just be the two governments in practice. It would have to be the Assembly or the parties. And what would the end product of those post-referendum negotiations be? A new British-Irish agreement, to be certain. Again, I would have thought almost certainly a totally new or a massively changed constitution for an all-Ireland state. And then there are very many other important non-constitutional elements. The basic questions of finance and economics and public services and welfare and health. And of course, what if, again, a substantial body don't engage or if consensus can't be reached? And then, as a ratification of such an agreement. Finally then, just very briefly, what does the text of the agreement say about the nature of United Ireland? Well, just as a sample, because similar language appears in a number of places, it's essentially that there has to be rigorous impartiality on behalf of all of the people in the diversity of their identities and traditions, and it must respect the principles of full respect for, equality of, civil, political, social, cultural rights, freedom from discrimination, parity of esteem, just and equal treatment for the identity, ethos and aspirations of both communities. And there are separate similar language elsewhere. And rather fascinatingly, the Joint Declaration of 1993, in some ways sort of founding doctrine of the process, included a commitment on behalf of Taoiseach that he considers that the lessons of Irish history, and especially of Northern Ireland, show that stability and well-being will not be found under any political system which has refused allegiance or rejected on grounds of identity by a significant minority of those governed by it. And that's not a Good Friday Agreement text, but an important part of the context. So all of this suggests that despite the fact of a 50% plus one legal rule, which is there, the institutional ratings in the agreement, which are consensual, cross-community, all of this points to attempts to achieve a broad cross-community sufficient consensus. And also, I would suggest, such a consensus would also be necessary when it comes to the process, both before and after a referendum. And this brings me, of course, to the conclusion that there would have to be much thought and extreme care about the process before votes. There would need to be also many, many questions answered about what the process afterwards would be. And it seems to me that in the process before, you have to be able to say what the process after might look like. And of course, the United Ireland, which would eventually emerge, would have to meet the criteria just mentioned. And in a way, only unionists, ultimately, could judge the adequacy of the elements of key importance to them. So much important as it is for nationalism to work out its own idea of a satisfactory solution for all, ultimately, nationalism alone cannot determine these questions. So as I say, the involvement and agreement of both communities would be essential. At the same time, I don't believe one could reinstate what would effectively be a veto. So, a long and difficult road ahead of us, one way or another. There are many issues to be sorted out, and we will need patience, analysis and discussion and consensus. And I hope, as I say, that this will be an early moment in that process. And I hope it's something of crucial importance to everyone on the island, citizens of all backgrounds, and also, of course, people from outside Ireland who are living here too. So thank you all very much indeed.
For inviting me to speak, and thank you to Rory, who has really helped me already before I speak, because my main argument is that in talking about the future of the island, and I've actually focused on the word hope in Jane's blurb about this event, and it made me focus as well on what do I hope for in terms of the island. And what I thought was, I remember being in Foreign Affairs and a Chatham House speaker said, people who think the 90s are going to come back are wrong in terms of the positive atmosphere, not the negative side of the 90s. The 90s are over. And it made me focus and think and reflect that what I would hope to see would be a return to the spirit and the mood of that atmosphere in the late years of the 90s when the peace process was really taking off. And that made me then consider in terms of assessing where are we now and how likely is that to occur. And the conclusion, not surprisingly, is that in terms of a united Ireland, it must be a slow process, it must be a delicate process, and that the road is very long and hard in, I think, foreseeing the stability of the island and managing that stability in a way that's sustainable, given the tensions we've seen recently. So in terms of hopes then, a return to the spirit of, I suppose, the John Hume vision of the island, of communities, not uniting territory as such, but that the essence is to unite people first, and to have shared identities and different identities, and to live and be happy with those identities. We see with Brexit how quickly things become polarised, and how that sort of shared sense of community has diminished. Within that then, the emphasis for me in the future of the island, and I think for many of us, is consent and the importance of consent. That whatever happens in terms of whether there's unification or not, it must be by consent. And Rory has emphasised, which is very interesting for me, in the Good Friday Agreement's negotiation, it seems a bit like Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, that maybe not huge attention was focused on how the United Ireland occurs, so it was 51%. And we see from the Brexit referendum how divisive that kind of outcome is when there is a narrow margin. So consent, in my hope, and I think many people's hopes and expectations for the future of the island, is central. And what Seamus Mallon emphasised in his autobiography recently is parallel consent. So consent is not just a straight majority, it's a majority in both communities, and that they would be happy to see whatever constitutional outcome occurs. For that reason then, in hopes for the future, I think the concept of a border poll, and various politicians called for that, not just Sinn Féin. I think Fianna Fáil, though, has really stepped back from that, as has Fine Gael. But that idea to be mentioned so soon is destructive in terms of that concept of shared community and consensual politics and parallel consent. So the timing, as Rory really mentioned as well, the timing is all important of when these issues are brought to the table and how they are brought to the table and how they are managed. So my second point, apart from the hopes of returning to a better time, is that British-Irish cooperation is up to the task and that it returns to a better time, to the period we had in the 90s, where there was such joint decision-making on the same page, joined-up thinking in dealing with the peace process. I remember, I'm not sure Rory remember, but I remember talking to Rory, maybe in a taxi or else interviewing him for my research, and he warned me against idealising British-Irish cooperation in the 90s, that there were problems, because I tended to have this black and white view, and I'm aware of that. But what we have seen is a very stark decline until recently. I think, to my knowledge, last night I happened to see Stephen Barclay speaking, I think on Sky News. And for the first time, he referred to Northern Ireland as also a British issue. And I don't remember any British politician actually saying that in the past 3 years. It was always an Irish issue, or the Irish border. So there seemed to be at least some awareness, not perhaps organically, but because they have to, of ownership of the whole process, that Britain is responsible, the UK is responsible, or the government, for Northern Ireland constitutionally. So the hope would be that we get back to that period, because British-Irish cooperation and the issues that Rory was pointing to is central. And for example, the scenario of what if the Irish government does not feel it's a good time for a referendum, but the Secretary of State thinks it is. That implies there needs to be very long-term planning and very strong cooperation between the governments in timing issues correctly, in, I think, deciding on processes in a way that will not destabilise and create further division, as we saw with the Brexit referendum when it was mismanaged in the UK. So what are the conditions that led to the 90s, and can we have that again, and can we get to this point of British-Irish cooperation being stronger? I suppose there were other issues, the US role, which Jane, I think, mentioned just earlier when we were talking informally. We had strong US involvement as well in the 90s, and of course we had EU membership, and both governments being in the EU was seen as quite an important factor, if not bigger. In terms of British-Irish policy itself, it was seen to be a combination of a process of close civil service cooperation, of a commitment to the central aim of ending the conflict. So there was an overarching common interest between the governments that was at the source of the cooperation, that built up then through civil service links and high-level, elite-level links. That sense of purpose vanished with the Brexit referendum, partly because, thankfully, and this is the positive, Northern Ireland is relatively peaceful. I know there's dissident violence, but there's far more stability than there was. Things have improved. So for the British government particularly, there was a sense, why bother, it's fine. There was complacency. For the Irish government to an extent as well, in that the British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference didn't meet after 2007, so with austerity there were other issues. But I think that kind of common interest, that perception of a very strong common interest, has been lacking in the past 3 years. So that perception has to be there, that it is important, that there is a potential for instability and violence in the longer term, without scaremongering, unless there is a solid British-Irish relationship. But we do start looking at the positives from a more solid base now, and we see, for example, the response to the Lyra McKee funeral, when at the funeral, when the priest who was doing the funeral service spoke out against intransigence, that there was a groundswell of support. And those moments aren't causal. I suppose I'm very elitist in my approach to how change occurs. They're not causal, but they do show that there is moderate support in Northern Ireland, that most people don't want to see violence return, and they are, relatively happy with the Good Friday Agreement until recent times. So that's a positive. We also see that the Irish government's lobbying, and thanks to Rory, I think, and many other diplomats, but Rory as being very much at the helm and in this process, was remarkably successful, I think, in keeping the EU behind it in prioritising Northern Ireland, and in that way in influencing the British government not to let Northern Ireland slip off the agenda. So I think that's very positive in terms of our diplomatic force and our political influence through the EU. The negatives are, as I've said, that British-Irish cooperation was not as embedded as some people thought it was, and we've seen many examples of that in the media, negative portrayals of Leo Varadkar in the British media, stereotypes re-emerging in the Irish media as well, where we see phrases like the British, for example, forgetting that so many people voted to remain in the EU. So we see all these issues. We see the need to incentivise British governments to cooperate because they are going to have a very large bargaining agenda and to prioritise Northern Ireland. So in assessing where we're going, in assessing the vision of the late 90s and whether that can occur again, that positive atmosphere, and looking at unification specifically, it's clear that a number of factors need to be assured before any referendum or border poll occurred. There needs to be very close strategic planning between British and Irish governments so that the process is managed correctly, so that sectarianism doesn't become reignited further because of it, and so that there is this community of feeling, which was very much in the era of international relations at the time in the 50s and 60s that John Hume developed, where people would have mutual sympathy, would feel they could live peacefully together, and this whole concept of parallel consent. All that groundwork needs to be there. We need to be assured that that's there before referendums occur, because we see, as we've said, how divisive they are. Irish unification then is a long-term aim or end of this process. Groundwork needs to be done, and in that sense, although I'm part of the project that was mentioned on processes to bring about a referendum and what are the best ways, I would be very slow to encourage bottom-up groups until there is greater assurance that that kind of community is there. Because again, when you have grassroots involvement, and we know this from peace studies, if society is divided, grassroots involvement does not solve the problem. So there needs to be leadership at elite level to ensure there is greater reconciliation occurring. And referendums then occur at the last stage, as was the case with the Good Friday Agreement. When those referendums occurred, I know there's probably more uncertainty about Northern Ireland, but there was a sense of support for the agreement, that this in Ireland, that the referendum would pass, that it was less of an uncertainty. So there needs to be a high level of certainty before a referendum occurs, and it needs to always, the timing, reflect that Hume vision and Seamus Mallon of parallel consent and community among the people of the island. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you to Jane and the Hub for organising such a great event. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm hoping to build a little bit on what Rory and Attain have talked about, because my interests run toward constitutional change and design. And so when we talk about border polls, I get professionally nervous, because my immediate question is, a border poll on what? And I'm going to take no specific example here, but it might be a good idea to have a vote on a vague and abstract question. Let's say voting on whether or not to enter or leave a union, with no real idea about what that entails, because it will likely result in years of squabbling about what that decision really meant, and possibly ruin your domestic politics along with it. And so my question would be, what do we mean when we talk about a border poll on a united Ireland? What is that entity? What are we imagining? What does it look like constitutionally? What sort of state are we thinking of? And I think that a positive of the last few years of this issue starting to be discussed in this part of the country is that we've moved past what was perhaps a flawed assumption that unity was going to be a bit like German unification, the way that West absorbed East, South absorbs North. I think that was in no way realistic, and I think it was deeply problematic thinking. And I think now we're in a position where we can at least start grappling with the realities of what unification might look like. And I think we have to do that in a spirit of imagination and a spirit of accommodation. And what I'd like to do tonight is just talk about a few of the issues I think we should think about when we think about a border poll and the possibility of unity. What do we actually need before we have a border poll? What do we need to have agreed on? Well, Tane's told you a lot about, and Rory as well, about the practical things surrounding the poll itself that we'd have to agree on. And they both touched upon the idea that we have to have some idea of where we're going. But there's a few possibilities for what that is. Do we vote simultaneously on a new United Irish Constitution? That's one option. A second one, that we vote on making a United Ireland Constitution in the aftermath of that vote. And there's a few possibilities then for what we do with that. Do we have a citizens' assembly and sort of all-Ireland forum that will follow, or ideally precede, a border poll and come up with some sort of firm proposals? Or do we have, at the very least, a set of principles, a set of guiding lights, that whatever we end up doing with the final text of the United Ireland Constitution, at least the voters can be informed to some degree about the vector along which we wish to travel? Because without that, in many ways, the question is only partially meaningful. It's a vote on an aspiration, not a vote on a plan of action. And so at the very least, I think, we need a firm plan, and ideally some set of core principles that will underwrite that plan. And really, ideally, we would write a new constitution first. To speak about that then, what would it mean to write a new constitution? Well, the Varadkar recently pointed out that this is probably a necessity, at the very least a radical, like almost unrecognisable overhaul of the Irish constitution as it stands, but it would seem probably preferable to start from scratch. That way you start fresh, politically and symbolically. You don't have the baggage of the idea of a hierarchical continuation of the present Irish state. And it could be easier in that process to consider really big changes in terms of the structure of the state, federal or confederal systems with a national government and regional governments, for example. But there are also complications, because it's not entirely clear where the inspiration for this new constitution comes from. It can be guided by the Good Friday Agreement, but as Rory has very much pointed out, and pointed out very well, the Good Friday Agreement is not a constitutional framework. It's not comprehensive. It was never designed to be a guide to creating a United Ireland in substance. It was a guide for obviously trying to advance the peace process, create successful devolution, and lead to a road that might decide the future of the island later. And so the Good Friday Agreement can't stand in as a constitution. What it can do is inspire us in terms of some of its principles. It can potentially give us some places to start, and we'll come back to that. But the problem really is that if you're writing a new constitution, you have the tyranny of the blank page. You can write down anything, but then you write down nothing. All possibilities are there. And you also have a situation where people potentially deeply disagree about what its contents should be. And in that circumstance, writing a constitution from scratch means that every symbolic or political issue that could arise, does arise for negotiation and contestation, and potentially gives you maximum opportunity for breakdown in consensus during that process. The third challenge is that it's slow to write a new constitution, particularly in a situation of disagreement. And the fear, perhaps, is that should border polls be seriously in prospect, it might be because of a change in circumstance that requires some expedition. And writing a new constitution in advance of a border poll might just not be realistic. So while that might be the gold standard, it might be that we have to do with something less. The third thing that I'd like to talk about is just to consider some of the principles that might underwrite a constitutional settlement, and some of the things that we have to think about in terms of specific issues that would have to be considered in even thinking out that settlement. What sort of principles would underwrite a constitution like that? Well, here's where I think the Good Friday Agreement is really useful, and Rory mentioned some of the most important ones. The principles of rigorous impartiality and parity of esteem, which guarantee in a fairly concrete way that different communities on the island will always be treated equally and fairly. It also gives us important concepts like respect for the diversity of identities and traditions on the island. It gives us the idea of citizenship being something that can be British or Irish or both in Northern Ireland, something that we might wish to transfer to a future united Ireland, because that is a promise that the Good Friday Agreement seems to make in perpetuity to the residents of Northern Ireland. Those are some principles that might underwrite a new constitutional framework or the writing of a new constitutional framework. Other aspects of the Good Friday Agreement are more complicated. For example, consociationism, this idea of cross-community decision-making that underwrites the Good Friday Agreement institutions. The idea that government, the police force, the civil service should be composed of people from both communities, all communities indeed, in Northern Ireland. Can you transport that into United Ireland Constitution, and if so, how? That's an incredibly complicated question, and the consociational arrangements that were made in the Good Friday Agreement, again, were not designed necessarily to function in a situation of a United Ireland. So how we preserve those, and to what extent, and in what system, is a real question, but again, an important part of the Good Friday Agreement. What other kind of flashpoints in terms of constitutional design will come up? Well, they'll range from things that seem trivial, but are in fact usually important and usually would tend to go in a constitutional document, to things that are more obviously deeply contested. The national flag would obviously be a point of significant attention, one would think, given the way that flags have played a prominent role in disagreements in Northern Ireland. Relatedly, the national language, obviously this state has as its first official language the Irish language, and English being only a second official language. Either a joint parity of languages or some other arrangement that guarantees people certain linguistic rights, a situation that other countries like Canada have long grappled with. That's something that we need to think out. Something as seemingly innocuous as the location of the national government. Is it too southern-centric to have a national government located in Dublin? Something that's been discussed when this issue has come up in the past. Do we decamp various aspects of the government to other places in order to try and have a less Dublin-centric focus? Places that are not Dublin in the south might also favour such a plan, given that Dublin's not always uniformly popular, 5 in a row, and so on. And ultimately, do we all decamp to Athlone, right? It's lovely at this time of year, I believe. Or do we set up a kind of Irish Brasilia in the middle of the country, some kind of new political capital? These are questions that we'll actually have to think about. But perhaps most controversially of all, a head of state. Do we have a president as we would expect in a republic? How is that president elected to make sure that all voices on the island are heard? And what do we do about the monarch? Do we potentially suggest that this new state be part of a commonwealth? Do we recognise a special position of the British monarch, as Ireland in 1937 recognised a special position of the Catholic Church? These are all questions that we'll have to grapple with, and there really are no easy answers. So to conclude, if these are hard problems, and I think they are, I think it's incumbent that we talk about them. And we talk about them essentially in the build-up to a border poll when that becomes realistic. Because this is a difficult process, and it's difficult because leaders are going to be reluctant to have formal processes considering these questions for risk of it being divisive. Unionists in Northern Ireland are going to be very reluctant to ever engage with these questions, to even concede the possibility of a united Ireland in the offing. And so if we're going to talk about these matters, and I think we are going to have to, we have to do it in a spirit of accommodation and a spirit of imagination, because in the event that we can find a solution that works, it might be nothing like what we thought in the first place. Thank you very much.
Can I say, gosh, I wish this many people came to book readings. Thank you so much for having me. As a Ballymena-born Protestant currently living and working in East Belfast, I have to say that the community that I mostly engage with probably wouldn't be too enthusiastic about the notion of a border poll. It's a bit of an understatement. We're still trying to get our heads around the possibility of a hard border. So I'm going to focus tonight on an area that I feel a little bit more comfortable with, the arts and the significant societal change in post-Good Friday Northern Ireland, which the arts has played a part in. I'm going to get to the border eventually, I promise. But I'm a novelist, so permit me to begin with a story. And Etienne has already invoked the dream of the 90s, so I think it's fair enough to take you back to 1995. I am 15 years old. I'm beginning to take an interest in literature, cinema and music. It is, after all, the summer of Blur versus Oasis, and Britpop is omnipresent. However, 15-year-old me is mostly shaped and defined by the conservative Presbyterian community I have grown up in. I attend church 5 to 6 times every Sunday, yes, that is possible, plus a host of midweek Bible clubs and meetings. I'm a pupil at a girls' Protestant grammar school in Ballymena. I know exactly 4 Catholics, and as they're the lapsed variety, products of a mixed marriage, I'm not even sure they count as properly Papish. I'm spending part of my summer at a young people's Bible camp in the Mourns. Let me be clear, I have asked to be here. Lots of my friends are also attending. This is the only world I know, after all. The Bible camp is entitled, How to Convert the Catholic Child. I'm not making this up. I will spend 7 days learning how to refute Roman Catholic heresies and bring people round to a more Protestant way of thinking. By Protestant, I mean right. Back in 1995, I held a number of things to be indisputably true. Catholics weren't Christians, the Pope was the Antichrist, homosexuality was sinful, and women did not belong anywhere near a pulpit or lectern. I also thought that Britpop was the pinnacle of artistic endeavour. Fast forward 24 years, I now hold binary opposite views on all these issues and many more. Did I change my mind overnight? Of course not. I may have progressed from A to Z in my political and theological thinking, but I've moved through a heck of a lot of other letters in the process. When it comes to changing minds, the kind of political rhetoric we've grown worryingly accustomed to, where one party stands in a corner, repeatedly telling the other party they're wrong until they're worn into submission, simply doesn't work. Change takes time. Change is about living graciously and openly with people who think different from you. Significant change always involves listening, compromise, and more than often than not, honestly addressing the lack in your own thinking. Alicia Garza, the Black Lives Matter co-founder, writing in the wake of the 2016 presidential election, states, "This is a moment for all of us to remember who we were when we stepped into the movement, to remember the organisers who were patient with us, who disagreed with us and yet stayed connected, who smiled knowingly when our self-righteousness consumed us. Building a movement requires reaching out beyond the people who agree with you." It is possible through fear, coercion, or even shame to change the way people think. However, if they haven't been given the time and space to journey through this process, weighing up the implications and exploring all the arguments, they'll only be paying lip service to progressive thinking. Their new outlook won't hold when any real pressure is placed upon it. In my recent novel, The Firestarters, I explore this idea of how significant societal change within a Northern Irish context will require time and space to take root. I write, "The Troubles are over now. They told us so in the newspapers and on the television. We didn't believe it in the newspapers or on the television. We didn't believe it in our bones. After so many years of sitting one way, our spines had set. We will take centuries to unfold." It's not just the implications of the Good Friday Agreement which have taken some time to get used to. It's the process of changing ingrained attitudes, long-held prejudices and ideas about identity. I hold myself up as an example of someone who's been through a radical process of recalibration in the period since 1998. Primarily, I am who I am in 2019, changed in head and heart because of my ongoing engagement with the arts. The arts have played an integral part in the peace and reconciliation process in Northern Ireland, bringing communities together, allowing international artists to bring fresh perspectives into the country, and creating safe, liminal spaces where Northern Ireland's traditional binary thinking is challenged and people can journey objectively through processes of change. For me, the catalyst for change has been a 20-year allegiance to the QFT cinema, where I learned more about empathy and other perspectives than anything I was taught in church or school. For others, it has been theatre, music, or visual art, which encourage lateral, objective, and progressive thought. The essayist Rebecca Solnit writes about how story and creative thinking helps us to change our perspectives. Metaphors are not how we define territories, but how we travel across thresholds between categories. They are bridges across categories and differences. I've been involved in community arts projects in Belfast since around 2000 and have seen firsthand the impact which the arts has had in both bringing communities together and challenging prescriptive thinking. This past spring, the Irish Writers' Centre invited me to facilitate a series of workshops with older ladies from the Falls and the Shankill. For 10 weeks, they quite literally crossed the sectarian divide, scuttling backwards and forwards across the peace lines to drink endless cups of tea, chat together, and write stories about their memories of growing up in this now infamous part of the city. Diverse stories unique to each woman emerged from these sessions. I helped one woman write a story about her beloved Orange Hall, whilst another wrote about naming her baby after the Pope. However, when it came to crafting our final poem, the women chose to end with a resounding affirmation of their unity. We are stuck together and stronger for it. They claim through the process of spending significant and deeply respectful time together to have found more common ground than difference. There are similar projects taking place all across Northern Ireland, making significant and enduring impacts upon people's thinking. The current stagnation of Stormont is seriously threatening the future of this much-needed work. If we're to move forward as a group of diverse people sharing the same small piece of land, we must learn how to manage our difference respectfully. The arts provides a wonderful model for this. I'm getting to the border now. The Good Friday Agreement ushered in a period of Northern Irish history where, for the first time in my living memory, it felt acceptable for a Northern Irish person to claim a multiplicity of identities, not necessarily contradictory. I could be British, but also an Irish writer, a Protestant who felt accepted and welcome on both sides of the border. There was a slowly blossoming culture of pluralism and liminality, where people were free to be in process when it came to both ideas of identity and the subsequent issues associated with how they approached politics and religion. I believe that Brexit threatens this freedom to construct our own complex sense of who we are and what we believe both individually and collectively. A renewed emphasis on the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland scares me, and I could probably say the same of premature talk of a border poll. If the border is no longer fluid, will we lose this concept of liminal space where identity can be constructed and adapted to fit the individual? A border is essentially a line, and lines speak of sides, a return to the traditional binary thinking long associated with Northern Irish culture. I, for one, am not ready to choose a side. I had hoped, in the words of the poet Louis MacNeice, to continue being various for as long as possible. I'm still making my mind up when it comes to many issues associated with being Northern Irish. Perhaps I'll always be in a state of flux. Arguably, this is what a healthy Northern Ireland looks like. We must always be learning, always adapting, and always open to addressing our own flawed thinking. We must be willing to live respectfully, generously, and let's be honest, sometimes uncomfortably with difference. Progress won't be easy or immediate, but meaningful change rarely is.
Absolutely fantastic. 4 really, powerful interventions. Thank you to our speakers. It's over to you now for Q&A. We always take 3 or 4 and then we'll return to the panel. I would ask you to identify yourself and, as I say, please keep your question direct and short. Who'd like to start it off? It's hard to see, so if you put a few hands up so we've got 2 mics going. Who'd like to kick the discussion off? There's over here. Is there a question over here? It's hard for me to see. Put your hand up and wave it around, please. No, it's right in the middle. Sorry, sir. Yeah.
Jane,
Actually, why don't we start here and then we'll come to you, sir. Please go ahead.
Donald Denham is my name. It seems to me that it might be a conspiracy among the four panellists that they're avoiding the other B word, Brexit. Isn't it the case that Brexit has already damaged the fabric of the Good Friday Agreement?
Thank you, Donald, for that question. Please.
Hello, my name is Thomas Dempsey. Just a quick question. There was an idea floated when I was sitting here in Trinity that maybe a 29-county republic could be established as a kind of a third way, with kind of 3 counties being kind of joined up with Scotland and the UK. I wonder, could you comment on that kind of idea that was floated?
Certainly an imaginative solution. Was there another question? Is there one? I'm happy to take one more if there is one more. Is there one just at the back, the lady here? And then there's one at the, yeah. And so we'll take these two and then we'll come back to the panel. Please go ahead.
My name's Kaylee and this is to all the panelists. What role do you think that education in the Republic has to play in this, particularly in the junior cert and leaving cert curriculums?
Thank you, Katie. And then last one. Where is it? Please.
David McKinney, just a layman. I'd just like to make the point, not directed at any particular panel, but we do need to be aware that in the Protestant tradition in Northern Ireland, where I can relate to Jan, using words like United Ireland really gets up people's noses in certain parts, and that basic stuff has to be taken out of the conversation.
As Brian Friel said, it's all about language. 4 really, really great questions there. I think probably the easiest thing is, Rory, can we start with you and just go across the panel?
Sure.
And then let everybody just come in.
By all means, I won't answer the question about education because there are people better qualified than me. Yeah, Donald's question. Yes, Brexit has, of course, it's damaged the fabric of the Good Friday Agreement. And I would say, in fact, to be frank, I think that the John Hume's vision, which was central to the Good Friday Agreement, of people working together, not primarily for practical reasons, but to promote understanding and reconciliation. I think those concepts were under grave pressure ever since the DUP and Sinn Féin took over the running of the executive, to be honest. But Brexit has made things worse, no question about it. And it also, of course, had the effect of accelerating discussion on this topic, whether we're ready for it or not. The 29-county republic, well, maybe the 4 counties could be the 4 councils in Dublin. But the 29, no. I mean, look, there were lots of creative ideas about a lot of these things in the 70s and 80s, and various forms of cooperation. I think the reality is that what we have is the Republic, south and the north, 26 and 6 counties. I really would be very surprised if another way of divvying things up would work. And for example, presumably the 3 counties which weren't a part of United Ireland include most of Antrim and most of Down, ergo Belfast, which on the other hand is probably going to be majority Catholic in due course. So in other words, I don't think it works. The final question, the term United Ireland, yeah, this is really difficult. Unification, United Ireland. The reality is that the term United Ireland is what is in the British legislation. It's true that our own Constitution, Article 3, talks about it's our firm will, in harmony and friendship, to unite all the people who share the territory of the island of Ireland. But in a way, a united Ireland ultimately is what it's going to. I don't know what other term you would use which would actually describe what it is we're talking about. But that doesn't mean that you don't have to be extraordinarily sensitive about the assumptions you make, as David was saying, about what that would entail.
So, Yes, I think on the Good Friday Agreement, Rory is the expert, but I meant to add in my presentation, I think, yes, it was weakened, but also we see the strengths of the British Irish Intergovernmental Conference, which I did mention, because it did resume, and I think there is an acknowledgement of how important that institution is to represent the governments, and how all the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement need to be working more robustly. So while it's damaged, I think it's also highlighted how much we need it, and my feeling is the British government is also aware of that very much. What I meant to say in my presentation was, in terms of parallel consent, and I think Seamus Mallon said it, and I need to read his book properly, I would think the Good Friday Agreement needs to be reviewed properly and amended in light of all the challenges that are occurring. And again, that would have to be managed very carefully and delicately by both governments in a way that doesn't create more division. But in terms of the 50+1, referendum on unification, or whatever we would choose to call it, that to me seems to need far more embellishment and precision, and David, with the legal knowledge, that sort of input, it would be essential. So I think the Good Friday Agreement has survived this, like the EU. There was a Spinelli quote about the EU: as long as it keeps going, it will revive and it will strengthen. And I think there's an awareness that the institutions need to be working much more fully, and I think that it will weather this storm. On education, I feel that very strongly. I think there's a need for far broader education. In Britain too, I have a lot of students who were educated in England who said they learned barely nothing really about Northern Ireland or about colonialism. So I think in both cases there's a need for more education. But I think in Ireland there can be, as an Irish person, a complacency that we're not like that. We're very broad-minded, and that we don't need to be educated. Whereas in fact, linking into the question about the term unification, I think there is insensitivity. And my late husband was English and very liberal, but he was very at times annoyed by sometimes the media and terms used, that if somebody said it about an Irish person in England, we would be very insulted. So I think across the board, not just about unionism, there needs to be more sensitivity and more education about the sensitivities at the level of childhood, yes. David?
Yeah, thanks very much. So on the Good Friday Agreement and Brexit, yes, I think I agree with the assessment that it was undermined. I think one of the interesting things about that is that obviously the Good Friday Agreement doesn't put a lot of emphasis on the European Union, any emphasis on the European Union or the fact of the open border, because they were just taken for granted, right? Insofar as it was really not conceivable that those things would go away, and it just goes to show that lots of things can happen you don't expect, and also that you can undermine and undercut things like international agreements without ever technically violating them in lots of ways. You can have a non-legal departure from an agreement like that. And I think relatedly it's important that we think about how the Good Friday Agreement survives or is superseded in the event of a border pull as well. What parts survive? 29 County Republic is an interesting suggestion, not one I'd heard. I think I agree with Rory's assessment of its difficulties, but there are interesting and sort of inventive suggestions. A joint sovereignty arrangement as well, suggested in the New Ireland Forum, where there's sort of two sovereignties over a territory, British and Irish, shared for some indefinite period of time. Lots of interesting ideas which I think potentially have lots of workability problems, but as I said, imagination needed, and we need to think about everything that's possible. On the education point, I think I'll just agree with the Tain. I think that's exactly right. And on the difficulties with language in United Ireland, I think absolutely it's a very difficult area, and I think there's almost every term that you can use in respect of any of these issues annoys some community on the island, and so that's a bit of a pinch. So either we come up with a neutral language, which we should perhaps try and do, or we decide that some terms are sort of basic political or geographic descriptions that we have to use, even if it is difficult. I'm very open to that discussion. I think it has to be part of it. But there are terms that are thrown around as if they're the only terms to refer to something when that's not the case, and we should be creative in how we go about that as well.
Thank you, Jan.
So I'm going to jump in with Brexit damage and the Good Friday Agreement, and I do agree with what everyone has said on the panel so far. However, one of the things that I have not enjoyed, but it has been a sort of a spin-off of the side, is I feel like the young people in our community are way more politically engaged than they ever were. There was a rally in the Ulster Hall on Saturday, and they couldn't get everyone in the doors. And I grew up with incredible political apathy because of single issue politics, and there was nothing really to get your teeth into. So there is a huge group of young people in Northern Ireland who do not associate themselves with either the nationalist or the unionist community, and they're really interested in the other issues of politics, and it's been wonderful to see them rising up. I think in 10 to 15 years we'll be looking at a very, very different voting dynamic in Northern Ireland. I haven't got anything insightful to say about a 29-county setup, sorry. The education thing is something I'm incredibly passionate about. I am a huge advocate of integrated education. I don't know what the southern system looks like, but I know what it was like to grow up in a Protestant grammar school in Ballymena. Said this on Saturday and Martin Doyle retweeted it entirely out of context. So let me explain that when I say I was 23 before I realised that the Easter Rising wasn't another name for Christ's resurrection. It was solely because there was absolutely no Irish history covered in my grammar school education, which is shocking, embarrassing and humiliating when I go to Norway to teach high school students who are studying the Troubles at 16. It's fantastic. So I think there needs to be more education on both sides of the borders, and we need to get our schools integrated. I think it's 9%, I'm looking at Hillary, are we at 9%? About that, 8% of schools, that means 92% of schools are still segregated. That's not enough. And I completely agree with the chap up there in the rugby shirt. I think language around this topic is really important. And also is it the sense that we're being listened to. I sit and listen to people from the unionist community all the time, and a lot of them feel like no one is listening, and that there are rooms like this happening where they're being talked about but not talked with. So I think language is super important. And can I also just say, there are not just two communities in Northern Ireland anymore. There are a huge amount of people who've moved from other places, and they have a right to speak in this conversation as well. So let's not leave them on the side.
Yeah, thank you. I would just add on the education, I realise your question was about the first and second level, but I think the universities have a very important role to play here as well. And obviously reassurance around the common travel area, and that at least on the island of Ireland, if there is a hard Brexit, there will be, the current arrangements will stand. I think is hugely significant, because I think Trinity, but the other Irish universities, at Queen's and UU, have seen a lot of integration, and many of our political leaders have been educated together, and that's terribly, terribly important as well. We'll take another round of questions. There's say Hugo there, and then here. So down at the front here, or we'll go at the back. So we'll take 4. Please.
Yeah, here we go.
Can you grab that?
Hello, Hugo McNeill, Chairman of the British Irish Association. Thanks for a great panel discussion. The Good Friday Agreement, the unfinished parts, I think Rory would agree, was the mutual respect and understanding, which would have been great for Northern Ireland in itself, but also was necessary for the longer-term ambitions of both traditions, either Northern Ireland as part of the United Kingdom, respected in Dutch, or a change in the arrangements with the Republic. My question to the panel is, do they really feel that people in the South, when they talk about this topic, really understand the unionist position of what it means to be British and Irish at the same time? And the reason I say that is, and it goes to Jan's point, another great writer was John Hewitt, the Ulster poet, who said, "I'm an Ulsterman of this place, I'm of this island, I'm of the archipelago of Britain, and I'm European. And if you take one of those out, you are not describing who I am." Going back to the person who asked the question about education, the history we all learn at school in the Republic is the journey with its ups and downs to being an independent, i.e. non-British state. Do we really understand the unionist position? And some people will have seen there's...
And Hugo, I'm going to cut you off there.
Okay, that's the thing. And the one point I'd make, Jane, the start of the rugby season, every year, people give out about Ireland's call, which was it's destined to try and bring people together to respect. But if you have a problem with Ireland's call, wait till you get onto the tough issues.
Okay, right, that's a good point. At the back, please.
My name's Liz Parkin. I also grew up 30 years before Jan did as a Presbyterian in Northern Ireland. come up here.
And Elizabeth, just use the mic. It's hard to hear you.
Sorry, and I'm absolutely shattered just to hear how hard Presbyterianism was 30 years after my upgrowing. I mean, it's just, that has broken, that has really, really shattered me. I grew up in Northern Ireland. I have lived most of my adult life in the Republic. I want to thank, before I come to a very quick question, I want to thank Dr. Tannum for breaking down, Dr. Kenny for breaking down stereotypes. I think a lot of us who weren't involved with law see law as a dry subject, but you were the one who made us laugh most.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Why don't you go to the question?
I wanted to ask Dr. Tannum, please, did I hear her say that leadership was needed rather than grassroots movements? And I just wanted to ask you about grassroots movements.
Thank you very much. Another question over this side, wherever the mic is. There's this blinding light. So actually, there's one here at the front. This lady beside Hugo. And then we'll take another one at the back. Courtney, if you just, yes, pass it in, please.
Thank you. The Minister for Foreign Affairs has just this evening published the 39th referendum bill to provide for the election of the President by all citizens, including diaspora citizens, which happens in lots of jurisdictions, but of course has particular relevance in an Irish context because of Irish people in Northern Ireland who are citizens. And I'd just be curious to get the panel's reaction, in particular about the impact on, or the unionist reaction to that notion that you will in fact be able to vote for the head of the Irish state. It's just me, and I'd be curious about your reaction.
Can I ask your name?
Jennifer Carroll McNeil.
Jennifer, that's lovely. And then one more at the back. Please go ahead.
My name is David. I studied Police Studies Masters, so my Masters dissertation, I focused on social identity change in Northern Ireland, especially in neither unionist nor nationalist. And I'm really happy somebody said all communities and not just both communities. My question is, for the whole panel, in the hypothetical situation of a border poll, how would it be sort of played to not bring it to a binary one or the other, which would, flare up the divide that is still in Northern Ireland?
Thank you, David. Jan, why don't we start with you? Is that all right? And then we'll work our way back across.
Right. I will start with Hugo's question and miss out the rugby bit because I don't know. Right. Do Irish people really understand what it means to be a unionist and have a multiplicity of different hats on? The bottom line is probably no. And I think we've all in the North come down here and had ignorant things said to us and stuff. I don't think for the most part it's malicious. I think it is just a lack of misunderstanding. However, what I will say is I think the dynamic down here is changing very quickly, and if you think about the number of people who've moved here who know exactly what it's like to live with a plurality of identities because their parents were born in Nigeria or they moved here from Poland, and that gives me hope that the next generation are going to understand that kind of complex sense of being many, many things. And to be honest, I think that's what the future of Europe is. Europe is going to be a place, a melting pot of people who live with a multiplicity of identities. I don't know that I can answer any of the other things because they very much speak to things here in the South. But I will say, I know it wasn't asked to me, but my Presbyterian friend at the back, who's asking about grassroots movements and leadership, I think in the North anyway, in the last wee while, we have been really calling out for strong leadership. And it's been very disheartening, very frustrating to have just so much invigorating and Stormont not functioning. The grassroots stuff is what has kept us going, and I love that Etienne mentioned hope. I could take you to 100 different community projects in Belfast right now where people are showing proper strong leadership, and they're leading with grace and humility and open-mindedness. So I think you need both. We need the strong leaders to rise up and say, look, I can see what the people on the street are actually doing.
John, can I just go back to the diaspora bill? I think it's Jennifer's question. How do you think that will play
the diaspora?
Yeah, the fact that people living in Northern Ireland will be able to vote for the president in the Republic, here, our president.
Oh, I think we'll love to interfere.
That's lovely, thank you. Please, David.
Thanks very much. First of all, thanks so much for pointing out that not all lawyers are boring. It's just
Really is the best lawyers.
Yeah, it's just like 90%. There's 10% of us are not. Whether or not we to go to Hugo's question, understand that the British or Irish or both identity that the Good Friday Agreement promises. I would think no. I think to some extent, though, the authorities in Britain sometimes fail to understand it. The Home Office currently disputing a case in the courts in Belfast, claiming that people who only claim Irish citizenship in Northern Ireland are nevertheless British citizens for the purposes of migration. Astonishing claim in light of the Good Friday Agreement, but there you have it. And I think it raises one really interesting issue, which is that citizenship in this new state we're considering would be really problematic, because how do you guarantee an ongoing Britishness and sole British identity for those that choose that, while granting full political and other rights to those people? It's a hugely complicated question, because an assumption of citizenship like that doesn't really respect that commitment. So I think that's something that's really important and we have to think about. Jennifer's question on the referendum on the presidential voting, I think that's really interesting, and I think that it to some degree reflects that ongoing dichotomy still in the Irish constitution between the nation and the state, and we have this idea that the state is limited, but the nation is a broader group of people, and in many ways it seems like just a simple expansion of the franchise in a largely symbolic office, but it's not, and there is that really interesting dimension that you've pointed out, and I don't have any good answers as to how that will play, but I think it's a fantastic thing to raise. And just finally on whether or not we can ever get sort of a non-binary referendum representing all communities, incredibly, or border poll, pardon me, very hard, because those sort of votes are by their nature binary. One thing you can think about doing, it's been brought up a lot, is citizen participation, so some sort of promise of all communities coming together in the Citizens' Assembly or something similar to thrash out some ideas. I think Citizens' Assemblies can be great. I think our one was very good. I don't think they're a panacea for all ills, though. I think we have to be careful before we say, we'll just do this and then Citizens' Assembly will work out later what we all think about it. So I think that's one way you can try and include people before or after what is fundamentally a binary choice, but ultimately, with that big vote on the whole, it is a binary choice, and there's very little I think we can do about it.
I think just two quick questions. I think Hugo's question about the understanding of unionism, I think no, I think there's probably a limited understanding, and I think also it's important to remember, I think there was a limited understanding of Northern Ireland in Ireland for decades. So it's people like Tony O'Reilly and the Ireland funds and that period that I think began to increase knowledge. But if we think of when John Hume, was it when he shook hands with Gerry Adams, and there was an outcry from a number of people in Ireland. So there was not an understanding of Northern Ireland, of moderate nationalism or of unionism. But I think probably back to education, there is a need to probably increase knowledge across the board. But we can't, I think it's difficult to make stereotypes. I mean, with the sort of racist comments we heard from a TD recently, but then you hear often countervailing points made very often by our politicians. So we have to be careful of stereotyping Ireland as well in terms of attitudes. On grassroots, I think both are needed, but the essential condition for me is British-Irish leadership. And Mick Fealty, who writes for Slugger O'Toole, the Northern Irish journal, I remember wrote about probably 18 months ago that there was too much standing back from Northern Ireland after reading the St Andrews Agreement, and that it wasn't, it sounds patronising, but in many ways it was not a mature political society yet. So there needs to be that leadership coming from leaders in Britain and Ireland to incentivise cooperation. And if we look at the Good Friday Agreement process, which Rory knows far more about than me, but there was a carrot and stick strategy of incentivising cooperation, and if there wasn't a moderation of views, then there were carrots, there was exclusion, there was not having a seat at the table. So a strategy is needed, and that needs the British-Irish level. And then I think that enables grassroots influences, which, as Jan said, are so positive, to have more influence at the level of the politicians who are leading the parties that can cause the problem.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, on the question of understanding unionists, I mean, I should say, in the spirit of full disclosure, my parents were also born Northern Presbyterians, and they met here at Trinity, and they never went back, which is probably just as well. And my son is married, although actually she's a member of the Church of Ireland from Belfast, so that's not maybe quite the same thing. Now, and I think so. I've always had an interest. My own view would be, from meeting people, even close family members and so on, that I think most people in the South wanted to keep as clear a distance as they could from the whole lot of them, of their unionists and nationalists. both, if you like, rather strange alien species. You know, what does James Heaney say? You know, one side as bad as the other, never worse. So I think that all of that. I think Hugo, again, when he talks about the total lack of understanding, I think he and I had lunch recently and we were talking about this. Every year, as when the Six Nations begins, it's like letters to the Times like the first cuckoo of spring. Why do we have Ireland's call? What's wrong with Ireland, the VN, etc.? And the answer is, well, because this is not a Republic of Ireland team, you know. But every year, so one point on that. I think there is a tendency, though, when people talk about the unionists in Northern Ireland, where there are many different kinds of unionists, that's the basic point, many different kinds of Protestants as well, and non-Protestant. And I think there's a certain tendency to think in terms of either people living on the peace line or picturesque orange men with sashes and bowler hats. The great majority of people in Northern Ireland are leading lives which in their everyday details are really very different from those we live down here. But yet, I mean, there are views which are strongly held, even if that's colourfully expressed. So I think to understand that unionism is not, in a way, there was a time I think around a simplistic idea, well, you know, by, for example, the idea of commemorating the Battle of the Boyne, and by developing the park there. Very important, but it only speaks to a minority of Northern Protestants, I would think. Grassroots and leadership. The Good Friday Agreement was entirely a top-down process. Yes, there were stirrings within the communities. Yes, there was a great deal of pent-up unhappiness about the situation. But that had been there from the very beginning. The great majority of people in Northern Ireland never wanted the Troubles one way or another. And yet, it wasn't until political leadership was exercised, and above all, I have to say, by the two governments. Originally by John Major and Albert Reynolds, John Major and Bruton, where you heard Tony Blair. So I think in a way that is fundamental. I mean, grassroots involvement is hugely important, but I think in a process of this kind, it is about political leadership ultimately. And then Jennifer's question on the president, yeah, I mean, it is very interesting because, of course, a long-term demand of certainly some people in Northern Ireland, some Republicans, has been seats for Northern Ireland in the Dáil. And that is, I think, to an extent, focusing on the presidency was a way to head off that argument. I mean, as you said, it's a normal phenomenon. The French ambassador is here. French people all over the world vote in French presidential elections and indeed in parliamentary elections. I suppose what makes Ireland a bit different is potentially you have far more people interested in voting living in Northern Ireland than you have maybe living in Britain, let alone in the US or France or whatever. The other big difference of Ireland is, I suppose, that the number of potential voters is much greater, perhaps, relative to the number of actual voters in the state than might be expected. So I think it is a sensitive question. I'd be interested to see if it actually passes in the Republic. I'm not 100% sure that it will, if I can say it personally.
Do you know, we've run out of time, folks, and my job, apart from to be the chair, is to be the timekeeper. I do, however, want to invite our panellists to each offer one word of wisdom, just a sentence. If you're going to remember one thing from this evening from each of our speakers, what might that be? Rory, what would be the one thing you want our audience to take away?
I think the biggest challenge will be to try to balance and reconcile these twin principles, if you like, that on the one hand, it is a majority which ultimately decides on the constitutional future of two parts of the island. And personally, I don't think there's any other way, because I do think that to introduce a kind of qualified majority is effectively to restore a unionist veto. And I think you'd have a situation where if you have 67% of the population of Northern Ireland in favour of United Ireland and 30% against it. But having said that, how do you balance that with all that we have said about consensus, a slow and gradual process, addressing these very subtle questions which David and others addressed, coping with the kind of people that Jan was talking about and opening up to them and getting them involved. So it's a really different question, because if you look at the wording of the Northern Ireland legislation, it's very simple. The Secretary of State wakes up in the morning, thinks it's likely there'll be a majority, let's have a referendum.
He's in Dublin tonight, should we?
And I think we all agree, and I think we would all agree that would not be the best way to go about it, but it's what the law says. And we have to find a way of balancing these two realities, multiple realities.
Etienne.
I think building on that, the slow process, I think actually the Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and Sinn Féin to an extent have been quite commendable, and that's more ambivalent, but just in not making unification, or whatever the term should be, a political football. So I think it needs to be really below the radar. Yes, we need preparation, but it's a very long, slow process. And secondly, of course, British-Irish intergovernmental cooperation needs to be maintained. And I would say, and it'd be good to talk to Rory about this, but that the Intergovernmental Conference, I think its meetings should be mandatory, as in the EU under the Maastricht Treaty, that it should be there should be regular meetings that have to happen. At the moment it just says they should occur regularly, but they didn't. So I think that is essential to ensure the hopefulness that I put forward at the beginning.
Thank you. David?
Yeah, I think just very briefly, that what the discussion here shows perhaps most clearly is that any discussion of this sort is complicated and sensitive and hard, but hopefully that's a reason to work hard to discuss it well and to think about it deeply rather than to ignore it, because I think that will lead us into a situation where we repeat the mistakes of our nearest neighbour in recent years.
Thank you. Jan?
And I would just say, don't talk about us, talk to us. And I think to challenge some of the assumptions that people have of what it means to be from the north of Ireland, because even tonight I've heard a few things that aren't really true anymore. They may have been true 10, 15 years ago, but they're not. So it is a diverse, complicated place, and every single person deserves the right to be heard.
That's really powerful. And I was very moved by what you said about the power of the arts in facilitating those conversations. And I don't know if any of you have seen the brief film that Stephen Ray shot called A Hard Border. The Financial Times produced it. Well, if you haven't seen it, I would thoroughly encourage you to go home tonight and watch it. It's Stephen Ray, A Hard Border. It's written by Claire Dwyer-Hogg, because it just simply reinforces, particularly Jan's message. Before we thank our speakers, just a few announcements. We've got a really exciting programme of events coming up. Next week, the 26th of September, we'll be joined by the explorer Mark Pollock and the human rights lawyer Simone George. And then they'll be interviewed by our colleague Ian Robertson, who's the neuroscientist and psychologist. And that's the last talk in what it means to be human in the 21st century. So love you to join us for that. You book through the Trinity Longroom Hub website. And then we've got two wonderful signature lectures coming up. One by Anthea Butler, who's giving the annual Humanities Horizon lecture entitled Irish Slaves in America, Myths, History and the Problems of Social Media. She's at the University of Pennsylvania and a phenomenal speaker. That's on the 1st of October. And then on the 5th of November, we've got The Future of Ireland, Human Rights and Children's Rights, which will be by Mary McAleese, our former president. That's the annual Edmund Burke lecture, and that's on the 5th of November. And again, registration is open for that as well. We'll have another Behind the Headlines next month, and you'll hear more about that in the coming weeks. But for now, I'd like to thank you all for coming, for those fantastic questions and interventions. I'd like to thank the team at the Trinity Longroom Hub who work so hard to make these events the success they are. But above all, I'd like us all to thank our incredible panellists for their wisdom, their insights, their compassion. This is the beginning of a hugely important conversation, and we've got it off to a cracking start. So thank you very, very much.